It's possibly the greatest what if in the world. What if the Shroud of Turin really is the burial cloth Jesus was wrapped in, and the faint imprint on it, the image of a man who has been tortured and crucified, really is Christ himself? The last time the shroud was on view, for 6 weeks in 2010, more than 2 million people saw it, even though in 1988, after a carbon dating test, it was declared a medieval fake, dating from the Middle Ages.
From 1260 to 1390 AD.
The story was supposed to be over, but tell that to the throngs who waited hours for the chance to spend seconds before it in reverent silence. And tell that to scholars who point out that carbon dating results have often proved to be unreliable, scholars who believe the dating of the shroud is just plain wrong.
This shows you how the crucifixion is envisaged, throughout the Middle Ages and into the 20th century.
Among them, art historian Thomas de Veselo.
If you look at the hands on the cross, the nails go through the center of the palms.
This is one of the Stations of the Cross at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola in New York City. De Veselo, whose specialty is medieval art, says artists in the Middle Ages incorrectly painted the nail holes through the palm.
That part of the hand is not strong enough to bear the weight of a body.
And of course that would mean that the image of the shroud supports the idea that it was much older than the Middle Ages.
Yeah, in the shroud, the crucifixion has gone through the wrist, and that's how they would have done it in Roman times.
An agnostic, originally a skeptic, he has just published a provocative new book about the shroud, in which he concludes it's genuine. Now, take me back to the events of Good Friday to Easter.
Well, you can read it off the shroud. This is, one of the most extraordinary things about this object. So you start off with the flagellation, and that's very clearly presented on the shroud with these very, very distinct marks of the flagrum. He then is beaten, and you can see on his face there are certain marks underneath one of his eyes as a swelling. His nose looks as if it's been broken. You can then see the crown of thorns that was put on his face at the same time.
Where would be the puncture from the spear?
Yeah, the spear is just there, the spear ring going in there, and these are the dribbles of blood coming down.
Just coincidence? But now here's the provocative part, de Veselo's take on the resurrection, what he says happened on Easter Day, when Mary Magdalene and 2 other women went to Jesus' tomb.
And they go into the tomb and they find the body of Jesus draped in the shroud, as we would expect. They lift off the cloth and they notice this strange, shadowy form on the cloth itself. Immediately they would have had this perception of it as a living presence in the tomb with Jesus.
They didn't see Jesus come alive again.
No, I think what they saw was the shroud.
According to de Veselo, each supposed sighting of the risen Christ was actually a sighting of the shroud. He's convinced it was what sparked the rapid spread of Christianity. The shroud was taken from Jerusalem to Galilee, then to Damascus, according to de Veselo, where he thinks Paul saw it and became a Christian. A relic thought by several important researchers to be the shroud next appeared in a town called Edessa in Turkey, and then in the year 944 in Constantinople. There's a drawing from the 1190s of what some scholars say had to have been the shroud. A French knight wrote about seeing such a cloth in Constantinople before the city was sacked by crusaders in 1204.
We can show perfectly rationally where the shroud was all the way back to the 1st century.
More than 1,000 years before it turned up in Liège, France, where Geoffrey de Charny, married to a descendant of one of the crusaders who led the sacking of Constantinople, put it on display in 1355, right about when the carbon dating results said it was faked. It's been in Turin, Italy since 1578.
It could well be the burial cloth of Jesus. I wouldn't discount that possibility. That's part of the case that he makes. The other part is trying to see how the discovery of this cloth might have functioned in generating belief about the resurrection. And that's much more, in my mind, conjectural.
Harold Attridge is dean of Yale Divinity School and an eminent New Testament scholar. We asked him to read de Vesselo's book.
However this image was formed, it was formed in a way that's compatible with the ancient practice of crucifixion.
So that is at least plausible.
That's at least plausible, yeah, yeah. And the blood stains, for instance, are clearly not paint.
That much has been proven. But is it Jesus or someone else? Or is it an expert fake? In 1898, this man, Secondo Pia, was allowed to photograph the shroud. The image he saw in his darkroom startled the world. The shroud, it turns out, is like a negative. Pia's photo is the positive.
And people did not know about negative images in those days. And so no one would have produced that image, no one could have seen the realistic image that's hidden behind the negative image on the cloth.
Instead of a shadowy blur, Thomas de Vesselo says a medieval artist crafting a fake would have painted a bold outline around the figure because that was the style of the time.
And there are plenty of other images of Christ which are meant to be imprints of his face dating from the Middle Ages, and none of them look remotely like the shroud.
In 1978, a group of respected American scientists and scholars, calling themselves the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, were given 120 hours to subject the shroud to a CSI-like forensic study. Working 24 hours a day, they set out to discover how the image was made, if it was a fake. They couldn't. How then did it get there? More recent research raises this possibility.
What seems to have happened is that there was a chemical reaction between the decomposition products in the body and the carbohydrate deposits on the cloth, on the very surface of the cloth. And this is called a Maillard reaction. It's familiar from food chemistry. It's the same reaction that causes the crust of bread to go brown in the oven.
HD photography has brought new detail to the case made by the cloth itself, its distinct herringbone weave. Even the way a seam was sewn is consistent with ancient burial cloths found near Jerusalem. Pollen samples taken from it show that at some time it was near Jerusalem and in Turkey. For just a moment, suppose Thomas de Vesselo's theory is right, that the image on the shroud was what Jesus' followers saw, not a living, breathing Christ risen from the dead. The implication is stunning. If the shroud is, as you believe, authentic, and if the image on the shroud can be explained by scientific evidence, what does that do to the resurrection, which is the cornerstone of Christianity?
Well, I'm obviously not the first person to deny that the resurrection happened.
Do you think it will be controversial?
Oh yeah, I think that there'll be reactions to it, and some people will dismiss it, some people will be intrigued by it, and some people may change their attitudes on one thing or another by it.
Yale Divinity School Dean Harold Attridge.
For many mainstream Protestants and Catholics, certainly evangelical Protestants, you have a notion that you need the resurrected body in the way it's described in places like Luke and in John in order to have a robust belief in the resurrection. That was not Paul's belief. Paul did not have a belief in the physical resurrection of Jesus. He had a belief in the resurrection of Jesus that was a transformation. And I tend to agree with Paul, but it remains something of a mystery.
As does the history and meaning of the Shroud of Turin. There is, after all, the carbon dating evidence confirmed by 3 different labs. The Catholic Church, owner of the shroud, accepted those findings. But when it was on display in 2010, Pope Benedict called it a burial cloth which wrapped the body of a man crucified in total conformity with what the evangelists tell us of Jesus. So what is the truth?